I guess we go right on to the message here, right? Okay. This message is really about what this congregation is here for in terms of specific vision and mission statement. I mean, it's here for many reasons, but there's an overriding reason because this is the only Messianic Jewish synagogue in the city. This is what we're about. And so this is a strong part of what our congregation is. And so we're going to talk about salvation comes through the Jewish people. And I chose 2 Kings 5 because the king of Syria, had a medical problem, and Naaman, and if you know the story, starting with the 9th verse, he's told to go to Elisha for healing. Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman, became furious. He was very nationalistic. The Syrians were the center of what he thought should be the primary nation of interest. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God." And that's Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. There's a name attached to that. "And wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, rivers of Damascus in Syria, better than all the waters of Israel?" He's becoming very, "Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he said, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan River, and according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And that is the truth. That's what happened. It's interesting when you talk about how God brought forth this great salvation through Israel. This nation was not the greatest nation, that was discounted among many people, that God chose for this to occur. And that they were chosen for this purpose. And that God would never leave them or forsake them, which we'll just look at that scripture from Romans 11:1. There is a false concept in the ecclesia, in parts of it. 60%, according to Promise Keepers, of the evangelical or the Protestant church, I shouldn't say it's all evangelical, the Protestant church believes in what's called replacement theology. Replacement theology is a hath God said. Has God said that he was going to bring that salvation came through Israel, according to John 4:22, which is in the next section actually. Has God said that he would not replace Israel, that God, has God cast away his people? Romans 11:1, God forbid, certainly not. Has God said that? For I also, he said, I'm an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin, Paul says. Has God said that? Has God said? So replacement theology that said that God is through with the Jewish people as a people, that the church is the new Israel, is wrong. The hath God said that Israel should continue to be a people in God's sight, and that God still has a purpose in them and so forth, that thing called replacement theology is a hath God said. Just like in the first few chapters of Genesis, when Hasatan, Satan, challenges, and says, has God said? So the fact of the matter is that that God has not rescinded his promises to Israel, or the fact that the salvation, the Mashiach, would come through Israel, or that God would restore them to their land. The very existence of the church requires the ongoing, in the second slide, ongoing existence of Israel. The very existence of the church. If Israel were to disappear, there would be no ecclesia. We are all, Jewish and Gentile alike, bound and connected to Israel. Yeshua said in Yochanan, John 4:22, woman at the well, you worship what you don't know, but we know what we worship. For salvation is of and through the Jewish people. And so he's clarifying right there in the book of Yochanan, which is often used erroneously to say that, the Jewish people have been rejected by God, and makes it very clear right there that salvation comes through the Jewish people. And she needed to know that as a Samaritan woman. She needed to know that and understand that in order to grasp and understand the direction from which this salvation came. So are Jewish believers in the body honored, ignored, or rejected? Some in the wider body believe that the Jewish people should be a messianic church expression, act like them, put aside every Jewish custom that was given by God. In the book of Acts, the scripture says, Yaakov, James, challenged and said that there is a way in which Jewish people should understand of the natural call to live as Jews. But that became illegal, that became criminal, that became punishable by death in the existing church, or at least various strong parts of the church, within the next few hundred years. And by the time of the Inquisition, if a Jewish person was found not having a fire burning in his hearth on Saturday, or was found to do anything that related to Jewish identity, then they were burned at the stake. Even before that, in the Nicene decrees, it said that a Jewish person had to take a vow in the Second Nicene Council, saying, I forsake all Sabbaths, I forsake all Passovers, I forsake all food and drink of the Jew. And if I return to any Jewish superstitions or observance, may my soul be set down with Satan and the devils. This thing, this anti-Semitism called replacement theology, streaked through the existing church and ruined testimony of many. Very, very difficult. So some in the wider body think that Jewish people should put aside what it is to be Jewish. And of course, those who are called to identify with the peoplehood of Israel in a more direct way, like those people who are from the nations who are in this synagogue, are also called to these things. But you too would have been persecuted in the Inquisition. Any evidence that you hung on to or got involved with any Jewish identity or Jewish observance, even if you weren't Jewish, you met the same fate. But that is not what the Scriptures teach. The Scriptures teach, Romans 11:24, if you were cut out of the olive tree which is wild by nature, and he's speaking to the people from the nations that were flocking to come to know the Lord through his wonderful ministry that he was providing in the first century. and we're grafted contrary to nature, and there's a whole teaching that goes with this in terms of the grafting of plants and things of that sort, which we don't have time to talk about today, into a cultivated olive tree. That is, that through the Torah and through the constant, hand of God working among Israel, there was a certain cultivation of identity and commonwealth that Israel had, and you are then grafted into that. And here's the how much more, which is the Kal V'Omer, the concept of how much more, which we find in Talmudic literature, we find it in biblical literature. If you, even though you weren't involved in any Jewish customs, you were actually pagans worshiping other gods, if you were grafted contrary to nature into this cultivated olive tree, how much more? How much more? It's a very Talmudic and biblical concept. Will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Their own olive tree. So the point is that believing in Yeshua is very Jewish for Jewish people. It is completely natural. It is completely spiritually natural. It makes total sense. If he's not the Messiah of Israel, he's not the Messiah at all. And so this whole idea is just sort of a relativistic sort of, well, there must be many rooms in heaven. One for the Christians, one for the Jews, and one for this and that. And Jesus doesn't get involved with the Jewish room. He's only in the Christian room. This idea that the world has, that there are many religions, and for those religions to have any connection with each other is a perversion. And that's the way the world views of it. No, no, no. If he's not the Messiah of the Jewish people, he's not the Messiah at all. If you go to some traditional synagogues, they'll tell you he is the Messiah. He is the Messiah of the Gentiles, like one of the teachers in the early, Franz Rosenzweig taught early in the 20th century, the idea of, that Gentiles are worshiping one God by worshiping what he called the Shtuf, the Father and the Son. But if a Jewish person did that, that would be idolatry. But for a Gentile to do that was okay. He was trying to figure out how in Western civilization Jews and Gentiles, Jews and Christians could get along well and not see each other as pagans. And this happened in Germany and in the 1800s and then in the 1900s, where they were trying to work out in the United States this idea and this understanding. And Isaac Mayer Wise was a part of that, who started Hebrew Union College here. They were trying to figure out how we could all see ourselves as worshipers of the one God, but God forbid it should be worked out in the same way with the both of us. It's okay to see the triune nature of God, if you want to call it that, as one God, but only for Christians. For Jews, it would be idolatrous. But that's relativistic. It's, I wouldn't know what to do with that as a person who was searching. What does that mean? He's the God of the Gentiles, but not the God of the Jews. How does that figure out? I thought there was only one God, and he's the God of everybody. But that's how that is perceived in the world today. That's how it's perceived. It took me a while to get my words out today, but I think I'm being clear. Am I being clear? Good. Whew. I finally got into the groove. Now, there's an organization very cleverly named by Moshe Rosen called Jews for Jesus. It's actually an organization. But I think that's very clever. And they didn't have congregations and so forth, that it was an evangelistic outreach organization, and you probably know some of the ways in which they reached out, which is, did a lot of street work back in the 70s, and so forth and so on. He's passed away, but the organization still exists, and it's led by David Brickner, and it's out in San Francisco, and they send people to different places, and it's called Jews for Jesus. And they don't have congregations. They did have one at one point, I think, with John Moskowitz, but I don't think that's, John unfortunately has passed away, but at any rate, but they're a good organization, what they do. And, but It's a clever title, Jews for Jesus. And the reason why it's clever is because it seemed like the worst, the most obvious oxymoron that one could think of when it was coined by him. He was a brilliant strategist, brilliant and a very bright person, and he figured, how can I get people's attention, right? So Coke for Pepsi lovers. I mean, how can I do this? How can I make this work? And so he thought, well, I'm going to call this Jews for Jesus. And so it was a very clever situation. But it's seen as an oxymoron. But it's not an oxymoron because it's logical spiritually. Because, as I said, if he's not the Messiah of Israel, he's not the Messiah at all. So but it's interesting the way the world perceives things. They like to have everything in their little box, and that's the way the world can be at times. So we're seen as the odd man out at Beth Messiah. That's okay. I don't mind being an odd man out. But I want to go back to Israel. Israel is front and center in God's plan, still, to this day. It's really important. It's of the utmost relevance, and the Jewish people are of the utmost relevance. If they were to disappear, then there would be no body of believers. So if Hitler were to have his way, he'd be destroying everything that relates to naming the name of God. Israel is still front and center. From here to the New Jerusalem. Just look at Revelation 21, 12, 13. She also, the New Jerusalem, had a great and high wall with 12 gates. 12 angels at the gates, and the names written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now, the foundations of the 12 apostles, but I didn't put that verse in there, but it's just adjacent to this verse. 3 gates on the east, 3 to the north, 3 in the south, and 3 on the west. Just think about that. For all eternity, in this New Jerusalem, the gates are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. There's a continuity, and I know Phil always likes to talk about continuity. There's a continuity from Genesis to Revelation. And there's no break in that continuity. There is a covenant that's given to us, a new covenant, according to Jeremiah 31:31, not like the Torah, that enables us to find a fulfillment of his gracious promise of covenant in our lives, and that will be made with Israel, that it was made with Israel, and applies to individuals, but it was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, the new covenant. But there's no break in the continuity of God's work. In fact, the covenant given to Moses, with all of its requirements, it still exists. But God has given us grace because we've broken that, so that we can walk in those observances. But at the same time that we walk in those observances, we are not under for the covenant of righteousness, the Torah, in that sense. We're under a new covenant concept, but we can walk out the covenant of Moses in our lives, not for righteousness. It never was for righteousness anyway, but we did fall short of it. All human beings did, and of course Israel did. It's the primary context there. So we see these gates named after the 12 tribes of Israel. God has never forgotten. If I forget you, may my right hand lose its cunning. The scripture says, you are ingrained on the palms of my hands. And I really believe that relates to even the crucifixion, perhaps. The concept of God's immutable, everlasting, never rescinded covenant with Israel is very important. Because if we lose that and we think she has been replaced, then we're going to have a situation where we are going to be in serious trouble theologically and in our spiritual lives. And look at the doors that have been opened through that. Terrible, terrible things came of that deception. Even Hitler's twisted perception, which he used the racial as the basic context in subhuman cultures and so forth and so on, would not have been embraced if countries like Germany had not forsaken this understanding. Once you get off of this understanding of God's work in and through Israel, and that has never been rescinded, anything becomes possible and deception becomes inevitable. I don't know if you can understand or you're receiving what I'm saying or you hear it or it's grasped. I don't know how good a job I'm doing. But that's very important to understand. Very important. And the voraciousness and the viciousness with which he's gone after Israel, not just to give her problems or to put her in horrible situations, but to exterminate her. The words of Haman from the holiday right around this time that we just had, to exterminate her. In no other case has that been so emphatic from a demonic point of view, that extermination was the goal. Haman's goal has always been the goal. Not just, enslave, not just, make a second-class citizen, not just have to wear a yellow star, not to just to do all that kind of stuff, but to exterminate. Because if he can do that, then Yeshua was a liar. His promises can never be relied upon. And the enemy owns the world in the most direct sense. Of course, lies in the lap of the wicked one in a specific sense, but in terms of the battle for redemption being totally lost. I see this concept of the one new man, which is often talked about from Ephesians 2, 17 to 18. And by the way, one of my pastor friends changed that to one new humanity one time because it seemed more modern, appropriate, up to date. One new humanity. So the whole point of the one new man is that we have a one new united humanity. But that's not what it says in Ephesians 2. It says one new man out of the two, Jewish and Gentile. That's what it says in Ephesians 2. It says the wall of partition's been broken down, that there could be a unity between Jew and Gentile. Each can have an identity, but like a marriage, they are united with each other. Like a marriage is one, echad. And that's what it means there. But the context of Ephesians 2 there, 17 and 18, he came and preached peace to you who were far off and those who were near. Through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. And the concept of the one new man, which is in the adjacent verse there, that concept is about Jews and Gentiles. It's not about, one rotten egg spoils the barrel, that you can think of different sayings about things. It's about Jews and Gentiles. Once on Apple, I guess. He came and preached peace to you who are afar off and those who are near, for through him we both have access by one Spirit. It's one man with two legs. And that's why it's great that we have an opportunity now, as opposed to what was years past in the body of believers. We have an opportunity to not force a disappearance. That was the goal at one point, even in the church. But that was not God's purpose. There would always be this identity. And so when we see that the king of Syria had to go through the river Jordan, had to go through a recognition of Israel, every believer has to understand that he is the Messiah of the Jewish people and the nations, and come through the Messiah of Israel. Salvation comes through. So I love what he said there in John, and so you've all read it, and I'm going to close with it, right? So the woman says to him from Samaria, "I perceive you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that in Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship." He said, "Believe me, woman, the hour is coming when you neither will worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem. Worship the Father. You worship what you don't know. We know what we worship, for salvation comes through, is of the Jews." And that's really important for her to understand, though, because she wasn't ready to receive that. She was figuring that we've got our mountain, you got your mountain, we got our understanding of God as Samaritans. He said no. Salvation comes through the Jewish people.